what automatically we accept this idea without a conversation. There will be automatic harvesting of all the data that is out there that afterwards will be commoditized. It's important because then what is my approach? Do I collect everything and I do maximization of data like OpenAI does? Or, for example, I do minimization of data like Heather does, keeping the respect of human beings and the dignity of human beings.
We must introduce the capability for self-sovereign AI. It is an operating model, a governance model, an economic and financial structure that allows individual human beings to interact with technological parity, the ability to have personal LLMs. And just as we wear different personas in the different walks of life that we have, our data reflects different parts of our personhood. That must be as compartmentalized as our social and behavioral constructs that create distinctions between who I am in my romantic relationships and who I am in this conversation with you today.
Welcome to another episode of the Untangling Web3 podcast. Today, we are delighted to be joined by two friends of the podcast, Heather Leigh-Flannery and Dr. Alex Cahana. Heather, the founder and CEO of Equidium Health, joined us last time to discuss data sovereignty in healthcare and beyond, while Dr. Cahana, a venture partner at Impact Rooms, gave us his insights on the wider philosophy of Web3. Today, in a first for Untangling Web3, both Heather and Alex are here in a melding of minds to talk about something close to both their hearts, ethical AI. Heather, Alex, it's a pleasure to welcome you both back to the show.
Thank you so much, Alec. It's a thrill to be back.
Likewise, and to be together in the same space with Heather, it's always a pleasure. Good to see you all.
Hi, both. I'm really glad we've got you finally on the same episode. We've kind of been teasing this one for a long time. And as Alex said, this is a first, not only to actually have recurring guests on the show, but to be doing this as kind of a more of a panel style format with all four of us. But before we get into this incredible topic, this was so interesting, I think, about ethical AI. Can we first just, give those of our audience who maybe didn't see your episodes, I'm not sure if they exist, but can you just give us a quick background about who you are and your career and why you're kind of in the Web3 space? Maybe Heather, we'll start with you because it's been a little bit longer since you were last on the show.
Sure, Jack. And also Dr. Cahana, I'm so excited for this conversation with you. Our thought work over the years and the sharing of ideas has been so profound. So I'm excited to be able to share it with this community together. Hi, everyone. I'm Heather Leigh-Flannery. I'm the founder and chief executive officer at Equidium Health. I'm an applied futurist and a serial entrepreneur and a deeply intrinsically motivated professional seeking systemic interventions to address seemingly intractable structural challenges in health, in social care, in equity. Our last episode together was one of the most joyful experiences that I've had on a podcast. It was fantastic to discuss with you Equidium Health's work at the intersection of medical and scientific advancement, and especially methods of making a phrase used in healthcare often, person-centeredness, not metaphoric, not an idea, not about creating the feeling or impression of person-centeredness, but in fact, making that literal and concrete. So that has so many implications for the future of AI that I'm excited to be here to talk about today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Heather. I mean, I can only echo your sentiment, right? That first conversation we had was so interesting and enjoyable for all of us. And it's certainly one of the most popular ones we put out there, as was our episode with Dr. Cahana. So, Alex, can you just very quickly go over your history and kind of what you maybe talked about last time on the show?
Of course. And I want to second Heather's statement that I too received feedback that the previous episode that we had was just phenomenal in the depth and breadth of the conversation. I always have trouble describing myself. Obviously, you see doctor before my name, so okay, it's a medical doctor, but most people say, well, he doesn't talk like my doctor. And the last week I was speaking in Silicon Valley, and out of the hotel room on the floor said, half crazy, half genius. So I think that's the best description of, an intellectual anarchist, if you wish. I've been for a very long time interested in technology integration in the clinical workflow. I've been together with Heather in the field of decentralized or Web3 tools to prepare us for the digital world ahead. So I would say that my interests are always not on the cutting edge, but the bleeding, the erythrocyte or the hemoglobin on the erythrocyte on the edge of that blade. So that's where I am.
I love that. I mean, they said Socrates was a bit mad as well, but he was also a genius. And I think there's a lot of comparison there, Alex. So just to bring us all up to the same page, Heather, last time we spoke with Alex about the philosophy of Web3, and that was an incredible conversation. But what would you say about the overarching philosophy that Web3 is actually centered on?
I think where I like to take that conversation thematically is on the nature of data and its implications in a rapidly evolving, massively technological society. When we started using that word data and we started building infrastructures and systems to govern and utilize data, its relationship to people, to personhood, was very different than what it means and implicates today. I think the Web3 talks about an ownership, a data ownership modality, not only as a set of property, but, and this is something I know, Dr. Cahana, you're very passionate about as well. We really view today in the now, what we're talking about is personal data being meaningfully or effectively inseparable from personhood itself. That causes a sweeping reconsideration of, let's say, the legacy regulatory environment that came out of a set of historical precedents where you wouldn't have used that descriptor of data. It wasn't what society looked like. It wasn't what it meant. But all of those meanings have changed. And the opportunity in Web3 broadly certainly is very significant to the health and well-being of humanity, but it expands beyond healthcare into prosperity and equity. It's about understanding a person to include the data about the person and restructuring civilization in such a way that restores our inadvertently sacrificed, our accidentally lost agency and dignity and privacy.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I took from that episode with Alex was the quote, "I am my data, and when a third party loses it, uses it, or abuses it, they take part of me." And that is such a powerful statement. I think it really resonates with exactly what you just said. And Alex, likewise, our episode with Heather was focused on data sovereignty. Could you give us your thoughts on what data sovereignty is and how it relates to this?
You won't be surprised if my thoughts are Heather's thoughts because we've been working so close together for so many years. But it is appropriate to speak to two Brits to talk about Magna Carta, and basically sovereignty really comes to that. There is no one above the law. There is no one that, this fight against absolutism that can take everything from me. And I think that the perspective that I take from it is, in addition to what Heather mentioned, really the interpersonal relationships. We live now in a world with 1 billion people consuming what the 7 billion need, and 7 billion that have access only to the 1 billion. So there are, unfortunately, heavy post-colonial tinges in what's happening in society. We are all, wherever we live, being in a low-income country or in a high-income country, staring in the face of social injustice and income inequality. We're looking at economic models that, highlight or support exploitation, extraction, and rent seeking. And part of what Heather and I are doing is not just protect and secure the data, but protect and secure human beings and create an alternative business model that will allow people to flourish. And we will talk about I want to say, post-monetary, post-labor market that will develop when AI starts, because AI will do a lot of our work, but it won't need our salaries. So how do we solve that? So for me, self-sovereignty is the anchor of not only personhood, but our interpersonhood and our identity as what type of society we want to live in.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful way to put it. And this whole concept of sovereignty, I think there is a distinction between kind of the traditional meaning and the geopolitical sense, maybe. But now with Web3, people seem very focused on this idea of self-sovereign, right? Being self-sovereign in how you interact with the web, how your data is stored and used and accessed, and how much control you as an individual have over it. So Alex, you also mentioned AI there, right? And that kind of brings us very nicely onto the topic of the episode, right? We talked about it at the front, ethical AI. So when we were planning this conversation, we were thinking, we've got this hive mind of Heather and Alex coming on. What do we talk about? And Heather identified this as a potential topic, right? And it's something that I think is a term I've definitely heard of, but I'm certainly not deep in the weeds on this one. So for our audience, whoever wants to go first, have a stab at defining for us what is actually meant by this term ethical AI.
Why don't I try the ethic, and then I'll leave the technology to Heather. Is just for, at least in my mind, ethics and morals are not the same. Ethics are the science of the moral principles that we grow up with, so that we will be able to replicate them whatever conditions are. So when we think of things of good and justice and right and fair and all those things, it's not sure I'll be fair and good and just with you guys because I like you, but with others I'll forget. So how do you create a principled framework, not a rule-based, because we never see what's good for the goose is good for the gander, but it's rather, what are the principles that guide us? And I think that once we understand that, what are the principles that guide us to create an artificial intelligence that will allow us to apply all those moral principles that we hold dear to us? And I'll just end by saying that is why I think that the ethical AI should be applied ethics and not different types of, I want to say, philosophical approaches that I see in the ethical thinking that, pertains more to epistemology or not knowledge and essence. You talk a lot about consciousness and ontology and metaphysics and is it human and all kinds of things that I think are just red herrings. And we really need to talk about how do we, just like in bioethics, this is why we created the principles of bioethics. It's an applied ethic. How do we apply these moral principles that we think guide us into practicalities that will allow AI to support us and flourish us and not the other way around?
One of the extraordinary things about Dr. Cahana, who admittedly is both half crazy and a super genius, he's also a philosopher. And you don't meet very many physician, investor, economist, philosopher leaders. And to have a conversation with such a polyglot is always a joy every single time it has ever occurred. And what Dr. Cahana just had to say is so insightful. And where I think I'll contribute is helping to bring it down into how can we create ethical risk management. And a first point I'd like to make here is that seeking to apply ethics, ethical decision making, always involves choices and trade-offs. The idea that there is a perfect set of decisions that balances the interests of literally every party and stakeholder is no more viable than if I were to ask you to list your top 10 core values and then hierarchically rank them and say, do I value liberty above freedom? Do I value love above productivity? What have you? We live in constraints within the arrow of time. It means decision making, it means choices. This is why systems of governance about how choices are made are such a critical aspect of what it means to have a living and continuous system of ethical risk management for the field of AI. But we're talking about technology broadly. We're talking about multiple exponential converging technologies moving at a pace radically exceeding the pace of the evolution of bureaucracies or human systems. So seeking to find a way to meet the representation, the governance, the transparency approaches to have our arms around these things as human beings is a major challenge, and at a macro level represents major risks. But just for anyone who hasn't gone through the most fundamental ethical tropes, you're in a rowboat, you have your daughter and your mother in the rowboat, only two of you can survive. If you don't make a choice, all three of you will die. That's a classic kind of conundrum that is used to explore what I mean by choices, trade-offs. And when, for example, we want to implement a program that helps rescue teenage mothers from potential homelessness in the city of X. I'm making this up. Does that mean that we are not prioritizing single men who may also be homeless? Example there is that would be a choice, that there's a choice being made to take this resource to do this thing. I'm not arguing what the choice ought to be. What I'm saying is that the systems of decision making are all about trade-offs and prioritization. And that brings you to accountability. It's not only who choose, but there will be unintended consequences, which is why these must be living, continuous systems. When there are unintended consequences, when harm occurs, who bears responsibility? Who's accountable? And how do you finance the redress of harms that occurred? For example, you get into insurance instruments, you get into capital flows. These are all parts of the discourse that are wholly absent today in what I feel to be like a soundbite, headline-driven, reductionist discussion about what ethical AI really means, and where I know I suspect Alex is thinking along similar lines too.
On that point, you kind of mentioned consequences, right? And we're in this apparently golden age of AI where everyone's nan can use it, right, and understand the benefits of AI, and it's absolutely everywhere right now. So a lot of these people will be asking, what are the problems with the AI? What is ethical AI and the topic in the field trying to address? Are we in this state of unethical AI? Could you give us a little explanation as to what are some of the problems you're seeing right now?
Excellent question, Alec. I think first of all, I'm expressing one person's opinion. This is not the position of my company or any organizations that I might represent. I do think we are in a state of unethical AI, which is, I think that even before generative AI, we've had multiple successive generations of what is meant as AI, from predictive analytics all the way up to today's generative models and retrieval augmented generation and all of that. We have used AI in a number of ways in healthcare that effectively create an automation bias by accelerating and amplifying processes and practices that unfortunately underrepresent and underserve and fail to meet the needs of many stakeholder groups, by the way, not the least of whom are physicians themselves. And what that means is when you're using technology to create automations of a system that is broken, you're more efficiently and more at higher volume, amplifying any negative characteristics of the system. We use scientific validation of our work in healthcare for very good reason. And lots of use of AI in our industry has been absent clinical validation completely. And then many uses of AI that are deployed into production have what I will call a low level of evidence, or perhaps a minimally viable level of evidence. Very few have looked at equity or inclusion or methods of public and population health level considerations versus individual clinical considerations. So there's a long way to go in our industry alone.
Makes a lot of sense. I've seen one of the biggest misconceptions I see with AI is they think, oh, it's going to have no bias. There's obviously no human bias in this computer program. And then you're saying, well, who trained this? There's data that this AI model is actually based on. And someone has said, this is right, this is not wrong. And I want the model to be based on that. So it's a really interesting point. I'm glad you brought that up. Alex, do you have any other things to add about why we need ethical AI?
I think that there are two very serious problems. One is that everything that we're talking about is data-centric and not human-centric. We're thinking about how to secure the data, how to privatize the data, how to unbias the data. We're not talking about us. How do we unbias human beings? How do we unbias our relationship with each other? How do we address those things? And the reason that is the second flaw, which I alluded to briefly, but I'll be very explicit here, is that our approach to the ethics of AI, at least in the technology community and the regulatory community, is unprincipled. There's no principles. They're just like, we think of problems, say, oh, there's a problem of bias and a problem of security and a problem of privacy and behavior manipulation and liability and all kinds of stuff. And I can make a list. If you have me sit down long enough, I'll make a whole book of what are the potential problems. But what are the principles? So when you go, for example, and use bioethics and the principles of bioethics written by Beauchamp and Childress, you just say, okay, what are the 4 principles? One is autonomy or respective autonomy. The second one is non-malfeasance. The third one is beneficence. And the fourth one is distributed justice. And they say, now I understand. So when Heather was talking about access and equity and all these things, these fall into distributive justice. And so why is that important? This is not a semantic thing on kind of being a party pooper and all that. This is really because in order for us to really understand the moral challenges that machines bring upon us and the morality that is incumbent upon us towards those machines, if we approach it with just this kind of like generalist idea, so like if I'm in the EU, I want to apply human rights, or if I want to, I apply the SDGs or all kinds of, large format or framework thinkings in the EU. Whereas if I'm in China or in the United States, I want to think of national security or trustworthy, right? That's what we're using here in the US. These are hollow statements because there's no principled thinking. It's all pragmatic. It's okay. I'm worried that someone mean is going to, create a bad machine that will kill me. So I'm going to deal with it as an ethical problem. That's not an ethical problem. And I'll finish by saying, so instead of understanding by principle, what are the challenges of, low versus high risk ethical situations, all what we're doing is trying to regulate what seems to us high ethical situations. We forget all the blind spots. We forget all the voiceless, all the unbanked, the unhealth. And it's kind of like an afterthought instead of really going through these principles.
Yeah, I think I was literally about to use the word blind spot, right? Because I think you might have exposed a blind spot I have in how I see AI, because I think I take the more practical view, which is the more problem-centered. You're kind of playing whack-a-mole with all the potential issues with AI. And you're thinking, how do we go and solve this one and this one? And they're not doing it from, as you're saying, this perspective and position of having kind of uniform ethics and principles to deal with the question, right? So just as an example, I think just to make concrete the kind of problems I've seen and thought about, as this is the issue with AI, right? You obviously had, this is before the whole Web3 and recent boom, but I think Amazon had a resume screening tool which had an internal bias against women because it was trained on the proliferation of male applications, right? That kind of thing. So in my head, that's a big issue. Or we're recording this right after OpenAI has just released Sora, right? The text to video model. And that's kind of amazing, but scary, because now immediately I think, oh God, what are we going to do about all the fake news and the misinformation that will go along with these videos? But actually, you've posed a really important question, Alex. Like, how do we tackle these problems in a holistic way from a position of unified ethics? Do you think that's something that can be solved? Do you think there is an approach that we can take, or do we have this like collective coordination problem there, as you say?
Yeah, I think it's just a very simple distinction that I'm sure Heather's going to appreciate, and that is, what is the difference between unethical AI and unethical use of AI? So what you described with the hiring nonsense that's going on with Amazon, that's the same thing I can do with how we're using facial recognition and all that. So, apart from building killing machines that by design are unethical, most of what we're talking about are the unethical use of AI. But unethical AI is a step backward, is a principle. And we're saying, okay, we live now in a data world, in a digital world, and we live in datafication, so to speak. That all our actions are translated into data. And so what about this automatic harvesting and collection of our data all the time? I am talking now to you, and there's someone in the background that is collecting everything and taking it and using it and abusing it and losing it, to your point that we said from the last conversation. That's ethical AI. So what automatically we accept this idea without a conversation there will be automatic harvesting of all the data that is out there that afterwards will be commoditized. And what then the commoditization of everything is there. We're going to sell everything on the SBT or NFT or non-transferable NFT or whatnot. And so why is that important? It's important because then what is my approach? Do I collect everything and I do maximization of data like OpenAI does? Or, for example, I do minimization of data like Heather does, because she's very concentrated on keeping the respect of human beings and the dignity of human beings. So that's what's important, is that we already are down that road of deciding things without reflecting on the deep issues that are simply just going by.
And like, I think I understand. I don't agree with how it's being solved now, but I understand why people go through that. They see a problem and they want to fix it. It's kind of like natural human reaction, right? Let's fix it as quickly as possible. And then I appreciate that we do need to go with this more principled stance. Like, why are we doing this? That's really what we should be thinking about. Why are we actually trying to solve these problems, and what's the underlying things that are going wrong? But say to everyday users, what would the benefits to them be? Both maybe the businesses who are using AI right now and the everyday users who are on ChatGPT. What would the benefits be to them of working in ethical AI solutions? Heather, would you want to jump in on that?
Sure, I'll be happy to. And I'll be transparent that this is work that my organization and our partners are seeking to advance as rapidly as possible. What we're working on is not necessarily systems that would directly prevent or change any use of AI in the enterprise and government space. Now, we think we can influence that to the positive in many ways and intend to. But the one thing that we're certain we can do, and that must happen very quickly, is we must introduce the capability for self-sovereign AI. And to be clear, that is not a different kind of AI technology. That is not what it is. It is instead an operating model, a governance model, an economic and financial structure that allows individual human beings, including when they wish to become collectives as families or communities or affinity groups, that allows individual human beings to interact with technological parity with the endless thousands of AIs that will be seeking to serve and influence them from across the private sector and the public sector. Many of those AIs seeking to influence them may be compromised. They may have intentions that are inconsistent with the aims and goals and interests of individuals. Or perhaps they are nominally aligned, like a Venn diagram. For example, a healthcare provider wants to see their patient well, and the patient wants to be well. So in there is an alignment, but it is a Venn diagram. It is not a perfect alignment. It is an alignment, but not a perfect alignment of interests. Yeah. So self-sovereign AI requires first data sovereignty, and data sovereignty requires identity sovereignty. So when you're talking about bringing that about, that also means you need a system boundary and a compliance boundary placed around individual human beings, such that from a technology perspective, a person looks like an enterprise from an IT perspective. Then this means, now let's say you have this. What we will have are the first self-sovereign digital twins. We will be having conversations with mirror images of ourselves that need to be completely private. Our approach is called the epitome, and I can't even imagine the conversation between Dr. Cahana and his epitome. That is going to be epic. I want to create
to see that.
I want to create a channel of those conversations.
We'll be releasing that one very shortly, I'm sure.
Yes, and so the ability to have a self-sovereign digital twin that is also an economic actor and agent at the discretion of the natural intelligence, the human being, is a really important factor. The ability to have personal LLMs, and that's plural, not singular. Why plural? Because individual people require information compartmentalization. Just as we wear different personas in the different walks of life that we have, our data reflects different parts of our personhood. that must be as compartmentalized as our social and behavioral constructs that create distinctions between who I am in my romantic relationships and who I am in this conversation with you today.
That's a really interesting way of thinking about things, right? And I just want to click on two things that you mentioned, right? Firstly, you mentioned kind of AIs being compromised, right? And I think just to make that concrete, this is a big problem. And it doesn't necessarily just mean someone in another country from a foreign government has taken over the model and is trying to do something with it. There's this thing called the Waluigi Effect, right? Where the more you train an AI model to say something positive, it will also be more trained to respond the opposite of that statement as well. So you kind of can get these strange situations where you get Waluigi instead of Luigi coming out of your model. And then you also mentioned this idea of self-sovereign AI and how you as an individual will interact with the AM models in the future. I just want to double check I'm understanding this correctly. So the way we're all using AI now, typically, let's say with ChatGPT and everything coming out, is you have these very large billions and billions of parameters, terabytes, petabytes of data being used to train them. And we're all just accessing and interfacing with effectively the same one, right? Are you saying in the future that we will be interfacing with different ones, or that we will be creating our own ones to use completely personally and privately, or is it kind of some blend of the two?
I will answer that with an analogy first. And Alec and Jack, you're younger than I am, and I'm a little younger than Dr. Cahana is. But do you remember the world before email? I do. There was a time in human society when, in the general course of everything that we ever did, individual people didn't have a digital address, which is what effectively an email address is, right? And then it became completely normal, very rapidly, actually, very quickly. It became completely normal for every single human being to have a digital address. And I imagine you may remember the world before mobile phones, but it was an absurdity to imagine every single person would go around with a phone in their pocket all the time. How silly. We had phone booths, we had a whole different world, right? And very quickly, rapidly, it became quite normal for individual people, not homes, to have phone numbers and digital addresses. We are in a meta paradigm shift at present. And the other side of that quickly moves beyond having digital addresses, which are email addresses, and mobile phone numbers and devices. Everybody has their own supercomputer, right? To we will also be our own self-sovereign AIs. So this doesn't change that companies also have email addresses and companies have AI and use AI. But in this meta paradigm shift, individual people begin very quickly to look like how enterprises look from a technology perspective. And that includes the ability for individuals to do anything that an enterprise can do from a technology perspective. I mean, we haven't even touched on the implications of using AI for software development or continuous integration, continuous delivery, systems operations. We are already right now today living in a world where 1,000-person IT department of company X, if you were starting today from scratch, could probably be a 10-person IT department to affect the same outcomes. And what this means is it is introducing the human being into technological society in a now completed process that has been in progress for at least the last 40 years. But it will culminate, it is culminating now to its end state. And that means, Jack, it isn't either or. It is personal, self-sovereign AIs, which again is not a different kind of technology. It's a different operating model that assures that there is absolutely zero conflict of interest between an individual person and their self-sovereign AIs who will be influenced and interacting with endless AIs out in the world.
I want to add to that because Heather, of course, is spot on that a lot of times we talk about that when we don't talk about AI, but other technologies, that now you have your own website. It is not difficult to believe that one day you will be your own internet. And so we talk about, tokens and things of that sort, and how NFT to Web3 is just like a website is to Web2. And what Heather's talking about, this self-sovereign AI, is the merging of this split identity that right now we have, which one is the Homo sapiens. That's the man who knows who he knows. And this is all the ethical conversation, I want to say left side, part of us. And then there's the Homo economicus of how we do business. So that's going to be the merging, because right now, Jack, to answer your question, right now you're applying someone else's AI. Right now you're saving data on someone else's computer, and someone else's cloud. And that someone else at some point can say, okay, I'm done. I don't want that. I don't want you to think that. I don't want you to say that. What we see, and we see that in states and nations. And so this is the whole conversation of decentralized societies, decentralized communities, nation states, the ability to not a B2B or a B2B economic model, but a C to C to C to C to C economic model. And that's where we're going through. This all connects, and we shouldn't just single out AI as something that is separate. It is, as we are moving from the physical commodity world to the digital, and right now we're in this kind of like phygital phase with spatial computing, and we kind of feel in and out and all those things, is we are going to be our own sovereign states, if you wish, be able to do everything. Defend myself, protect myself, feed myself, work, create. I will talk to whoever I want, when I want, how I want. That is the ultimate freedom. And Chris Dixon just came out with a book that I wrote about, the read, write, own. And it's that own. All what we're talking about is own, that right now we are excluded. Our Homo sapiens, there are countries that allow us more to express ourselves and other countries that we can't say a thing. But when it comes to Homo economicus, we're not part of this. None of us here on this panel is part of this. There are 147 families in the world that own 70% of the assets. Those are the people who are in the Homo economicus, not us. We're just spectators that are breadcrumbed, enough that we won't revolt. That will change. AI will change that. AI will change not only the power between the haves and the haves not, but our perception between what is personal versus what is private versus what is public.
And Alex, I have to get your take on this as well. How do you think this fits in with the AGI, or the artificial general intelligence? I can't tell if it aligns or it goes against it, because this is a real paradigm shift of how we think about these types of technologies.
I think where AGI fits in, and we should have a separate episode.
You might want to define it first, just in case our listeners aren't sure what the AGI is.
I would say, and Heather, feel free to correct me, but right now, the intelligence that we're talking about, that machines are doing stuff that seem to us as intelligent actions, are in the narrow sense of they're just simulating. It seems that they understand what they're saying. It seems that they're answering correctly until they stop. Whereas the strong form, at least, of general artificial intelligence, to say they actually will be, if not as us, even better than us in our abilities to perform intelligent actions. And so in that sense, it's not a bad thing. They might be more moral, more empathetic, more, right now they're just faster computers. So if you ask me what is the square root of what big number, they can immediately throw up. But the idea of AGI is that they will be better people. I think that what AI should do, instead of worrying about are they going to be better humans, will they be that Nietzsche Übermensch, I don't know, is more how will they help us be better humans? That's really what this is about. So where AGI kind of in my opinion, fits into this conversation is that it forces us, and again, the propos of today is ethical AI, is to think what are our moral obligations towards each other and also towards other creatures on the planet and also to the machines. And so if you start to divide, think of it of, okay, what are basic functions? Sensation, memory, perception, intelligence, self-aware, you're like it gets more and more. So if it's just like a tiny sensation and memory, I don't have any moral obligation to something that, can feel something and has some gigabytes or terabytes or petabytes of memory. But then when it starts to show me some emotion, in other words, that certain mental state causes it to do something or shows some intelligence, then yeah, that would be like a low equivalent moral obligation to that entity. But then when we start to talk about, the higher states of, they're self-aware and maybe they'll be super intelligent and they have rationality and can provide radical empathy, then we have a high obligation. So, I always laugh and say that as people are worried that AI will take their job and say, oh my God, I can now write a medical note in 2 seconds and we won't need doctors or pain doctors or psychiatrists in this, maybe there'll be for the machines a pain doctor, or maybe I'll be a psychologist between two machines that are fighting with each other. I don't know. I'll do counseling for the AGIs. But I think that the context of AGI in this conversation is how do we dissect our moral obligation to each other and to other living and non-living entities in the world that is around us.
And I think just on that point, one of the really interesting things that I think has got a lot of people maybe worried and sometimes excited is this is one of the first times in the history of humanity, probably for at least millions of years, that something might be superior to humanity on the cognitive sense, right? And it's kind of making people think, well, how do we treat animals? How do we treat plants? How do we treat life, And if there's something that all of a sudden is higher on the hierarchy and they treat us the way we've treated the things beneath us, well, that's quite a scary paradigm. And that's why I think people are really starting to consider the ethical, moral argument of how should we interact with other life forms, right? Because we don't want things to treat us the way we treat them. But yeah, it's a really interesting topic.
Yeah. I was going to say, Alec, on that exactly that point, right? Because we're still talking about ethics and how we treat AI and how we interact with them. We should probably sort out how we do it with each other first, and how we are better human to human before we even think about that. But now we're getting into the really abstract stuff. And to bring it back just for a moment, okay? So you guys, I think Heather, you've hinted a little bit there earlier on about what you're actually doing in this space. I'd love to go from the abstract to the more practical, and if you can share with us kind of any insights or kind of hints to what you are working on to make this idea of ethical AI a reality, it'd be great to hear about that, especially if there's anything you're working on together as well.
It's an exciting time for sure. I can't resist just quickly commenting on the AGI theme. I'm sorry, I can't not. But a couple of quick points I'd like to make is that there's AGI that accomplishes the things that we describe as the outputs of what an AGI can do. And then there's AGI that is potentially sentient. And that very quickly moves us into the description of what is human and what is not, and where we have historically systems of accelerated dehumanization, for example, that resulted in the Holocaust. When we move to models where we need to be thinking about sentient beings, of which humans are a sentient being. And everything that we talked about earlier in this podcast with respect to AI sovereignty, if we're talking about an AGI that is sentient, as opposed to an AGI that can perform, produce, deliver things that are outputs, but is not a sentient entity, a non-sentient AGI can be self-sovereign and will be. And the idea of a general purpose AI, the general capabilities are already very rapidly expanding. But if we talk about something that's sentient, if that became self-sovereign, that would be a slave. And we do not believe in slavery in our civilization any longer. And that does bring us back. It is a segue back into, you asked for some, what's going on practically right now. How are we building toward this vision? If our overall principle is that personal data has become integrated with personhood, it just as every major technological advancement in the history of humanity has become part of our personhood. Our chief scientific officer that Dr. Cahana knows well, Dr. Sean Mannion, describes these devices as our extended neocortex. And every breath we take, even it isn't only my actions and deeds and words and choices, it's the functioning of my biology itself, all of which is increasingly part of the data that is exponentially increasing in every move I make, every purchase I make, every place I go, etc. So one of the most urgent things that must occur as a precedent condition to being able to implement living systems of ethical risk management with inclusive governance, transparency, and accountability, etc., is that you have to implement the legal constructs that can begin to enforce and clarify all of the distinctions between these new relationships between individuals, families, and communities, and the state and corporations. And getting that baseline set of new institutions, that's really what it is. These are new institutions that are not reflected. You can see them in the negative space of society today. Where are the missing pieces? So we are bringing about a set of new institutions that we purport can begin to go down this path. And that involves also a whole lot of technology, lots and lots of technology that can facilitate different approaches to machine learning, to the uses of AI at runtime, to especially systems of validation, control, and guardrails regarding the use of AI, all moving quickly toward this new system boundary around the individual that can be the nucleus of creating that construct. So you can't have new capital flows and new economic distribution without establishing these constructs that can then receive and make and ride on new payment rails, for example. So it's first things first, but fast as we can. And there's lots of detail there, but I hope that gives you a sense of it.
No, it definitely does. And I'm excited to see all the announcement that comes out on this line of work. It's going to be an incredible piece of work. I think, we obviously, this topic has been ethical AI, but you are both at the center of Web3 in my mind and have many projects in the space. I'd love to hear from both of you. What are you most excited for the future of Web3 generally and long term in the space?
Well, I can start by saying I'm excited by the project that I'm doing right now. Together with a couple of colleagues, we purchased a private island in the South Pacific in the country of Vanuatu. The reason we chose Vanuatu is because not only is it a paradisiac place, but also it's been on the top, even though it's a low-income country, it has been on the top of the happiest countries on the planet for the last 25 years. So I had to go down and see, okay, why are you so happy making less than $4 a day? And in that space, actually, we are applying as a social experiment all these technologies that are driven by LLMs, by LAMs, large action models, that are principle-based, that we're not a rule-based community. We are schema-based, saying, the only thing that needs to happen is that you bring more energy into the island than you take from the island. And so we measure everything, everywhere from water consumption to steps to how loud you speak, and really try to create an environment where deep thinkers and doers like Heather and Sean and the whole team there can apply those principles. I think that what excites me is that, and I'm kind of paraphrasing on Atul Gawande, this is the first time in history where we're doing wrong things because of ineptitude. It's not because we don't know stuff that we're not doing it. We know stuff, and if we don't know, we can ask, and that machine will know. We don't know because of we don't know because of choice, because we decide to be inept, because we decide that it's convenient for us to be ignorant. And that really brings us, to the question of knowledge and what is knowledge. And I want to say that it's exciting because for the first time you realize that there is no limits to what you can think about, even if there are no words to express them. It is incumbent upon us not to ignore it, because when you start ignoring things, when you start to create a reality that doesn't exist, you introduce ignorance and you become ignorant. And there's no reason now, with all the technology that we have, and I always say this, and Heather heard me say this dozens of times, it's not the artificial intelligence that I'm worried about, it's the natural stupidity.
Love that line.
I love that.
For years. So great.
Wow, Alex, that project sounds incredible. That is really impactful stuff. I think, Heather, we are coming to the final moments of the show. If you could just give us a really brief, what are you most excited for in the Web3 space more generally, that would be great.
Sure. I'll say that my activity in Web3 has been about this intersectionality between Web3 and AI from day one. So it has always been about that. And I'm very excited because Web3 is the core mechanic through which we can create the institutions, the guardrails, the controls, the safety, the orchestration of, we're talking about technology for computational trust, technology for massively multi-party coordination, technology for entirely new methods of systems of compensation, using value exchange across any way that individuals wish to define that value. There's the implications for freedom and liberty and civil liberties that were envisioned. Alex mentions the Magna Carta. I am an American patriot, and I also am very passionate about the ideas of Western liberalism across the board. And the idea that if you look at a wide enough arc, we are coming full circle into the intentions of extraordinary thinkers that shaped our age from many generations ago. And that we are right now at the fulcrum of the realization of that kind of liberty and agency and systems of governance and government that can enforce and protect and defend those systems. That moves me profoundly and has me leaping out of bed every morning. And Web3 it's the heart and the foundation of all of that. So we could go point by point through every technology and tactic under the Web3 umbrella, but I think our audience understands what that means, and you all do. So that's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really powerful way to state it. And it's not often you hear someone with that much passion, I think, for getting up and going to work every day. And I think the whole idea around liberty, civil liberty, personal liberty, self-sovereignty, that is something that can, get people out of bed. I think it's one of the reasons why the Web3 movement has taken off so much. So we're at the end of the show now. And as you know, as friends of the podcast, we always end the show with 2 standard questions. Now, I'm going to make an executive decision here. I think we don't need to ask you a one sentence what Web3 is to you. I think you spent an hour telling us exactly what you think. And if you want to hear a one sentence version, you can go listen to both Heather and Alex's previous episodes. But I am going to ask you the second question, okay? So we always ask, as you know, if you could choose anybody on the planet today from throughout history, could even be someone fictional, maybe someone from your June poster, Heather, in the background. If you could find anyone to sit down and discuss Web3 with, who would it be and why? And I want to hear an answer that's different to last time. So Heather, maybe we'll start with you and go to Alex. Heather, last time you said Mahatma Gandhi. Who would you choose this time?
Frank Herbert. Frank Herbert's a science fiction author. And you may notice behind me, you see that's a sandworm floating ominously over my head. And this is a movie poster from a version of Dune, the sci-fi classic that was never produced. I am a huge fan of Frank Herbert and the Dune universe and everything about it. And that world takes place notionally something like 10, 20,000 years in the future of today. And it is against a backdrop where 10,000 years ago, sentient AI had decided to attack humanity. And humanity went through a massive 1,000-year struggle to overcome, and then had to create a new civilization. And this new civilization is now 10,000 years old nominally. That's the backdrop. Frank Herbert is an extraordinarily prescient individual. And I want to talk about how it is that we can realize extraordinary benefit for the future of humanity, how we can prevent endless human suffering, and how we can do it in a way that doesn't require revolutions and doesn't move at the pace of evolution, but instead can be brisk and directed by heartfelt and visionary leaders all over the world.
Yeah, I think that's a really awesome answer. And obviously in June, there's always all these themes of sovereignty and, states and things, and how individuals work alongside each other, for the greater good. So I think that fits perfectly with your whole thesis on Web3. Alex, how about you? Last time you gave us Emmanuel Levinas, who is a French philosopher. So who would you go for this time at the dinner party?
So I think someone a little bit older than him. His name is Edmund Husserl. This time he is a German philosopher. The reason I chose him in the 19th century, the reason I chose him was because he was a mathematician. And all this, thing about AI and algorithms and math and all this. And so his passion was to explain the world through math. And in that 50-year journey of trying to do that, he realized that actually it's philosophy, or the philosophy of math, that really is explained. And so I would like to ask him, so what does he think about AI and the philosophy of AI that is behind that, is forcing us to think about personhood, humanity, interperson and intersubjective experiences, and thinking about the aboutness of ourselves and about the world, the wonderful world that is around us. And I want to say that the thing that he came up with that I think is so unique is that he said unique is not special. Because when I say that I'm special, I mean that then you're not. So you're unique, Jack, Alec, Heather. Each and every one of us is unique. In other words, unique is common. What makes us human is that we're unique. And that uniqueness will, not only can, but will be captured by these technologies that we coined them together as Web3, that it just solidifies this phygital world around us and reminds us that we're human. This is what it's all about.
It's a great answer. And it's another one to add to the reading list, it seems. Every time Alex comes on, I have someone else that I need to read up on. So thank you for that. This is the second time you've both been on, I'm sure, and I hope it won't be the last. But thank you both for joining us. And thank you to those listening wherever you may be. And join us next time as we untangle a little more of Web3. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Untangling Web3.
Don't forget to send us your thoughts, questions, and comments on social media. And be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast provider to catch the next episode. See you next time to untangle a little bit more of Web3.
The views we express here are our own and do not reflect the views of our employers.